Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Easy Conversations, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host for Candandia. In this week's episode, I sit down with Tori Warner, who is the author of the book Challenge the Anxious Brain. Tori and I talk about anxiety and how it impacts people's lives, and Tori also shares her own story about anxiety and how she struggled early in life and how she's been able to navigate it over the years. Based on her own story, she decided to write a book and share some of the tools she's used over the years to be able to overcome anxiety. I hope you can get as much as I did from this episode. If at the end you could leave a review, I would truly appreciate it. Right, Tori, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you joining today, taking the time, and I'm super grateful for you wanting to come here and discuss your book and some of the topics we've already discussed. So, with that being said, I would, if you could take some time to introduce yourself and maybe even mention your book and talk a little bit about that as well.
Hi. Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to come on and talk. As we said just before we started recording, I was only recently introduced to the podcast and I've been really enjoying it, and the content that you produce, I think is really helpful. So I'm Tori. I had long-term interest in mental health and supporting people with mental health
Hmm.
issues. And more recently, I started to write a book about anxiety, because that was the particular strain of mental health challenges that I battled with and have battled with through my life.
Hmm.
It took a long time to put this book together, actually. It felt at the beginning that it was going to be quite an easy process, but with most of these things that resonate, personal stories, usually takes longer than you think it's going to. So I'm super grateful that it's now finished. And the aim of the book is to, firstly, to kind of share my personal experience and relationship with anxiety, and how that has demonstrated throughout my life. But also, secondary, to provide hopefully some really straightforward tools for people to use in their everyday life to overcome anxiety. It's not a overly complicated um, list of instructions of how to cure anxiety. It's more of a buffet style
Hmm.
tips and tools that I've used over the years. And so I wanted to share those. And the best way to do that, I found, was to have it in a book.
Oh, that's
And so
amazing.
the book came out last week, and been really, yeah, I've been really pleased with the feedback so far from people who have found it useful.
No, that's great. And just for the listeners, what's the title of the book, and what inspired the title?
So the title is called Challenging the Anxious Brain. And where that came from is, historically, I've been interested in lots of routes of therapy of anxiety, from CBT, mindfulness, and then more recently, I've been really interested in the kind of neuroscience of anxiety. So, what is actually happening on a physiological and chemical level. Um, and for me personally, I found that incredibly helpful to challenge my thoughts, because I could break down actually what was happening inside my brain, and it wasn't something that was alien. It was something that I could understand and therefore challenge. And I think once you start challenging your thoughts, not just around anxiety, but I think it's also applicable with many um, other mental health issues such as depression. Once you start challenging those kind of thought processes, you can kind of find a way through them in a much more um, less confrontational way with yourself, and you stop
Hmm.
the battle against yourself. So I
Absolutely.
wanted the book to be about challenging your brain and acknowledging that you may have an anxious mindset at the moment, but that isn't a mindset, isn't something that's static. It's something that can change,
Hmm.
and you can change yourself.
For sure, for sure. And I guess for more on a personal note, Tori, so you mentioned you recently finished this book. How were you able to balance it? Because I know you've got a family. Like maybe talk about that a little bit, and how were you able to balance family time and being able to make time for this book?
Yeah, yeah. So I do have a family. I have two children, and but they're a little bit older than yours. So mine are
Yeah,
12 and 14. So they're more on the challenging side rather than the entertaining side now.
they
Um,
probably bring more into the anxiety, I would say.
yeah. It's a different sphere that they
Yeah.
open you up to, that's for sure. Um, but I also work as well. I have
Yeah.
a director in a recruitment company, so my time is it's been very well used over the
Hmm.
recent years. But I was really committed that this was something I wanted to do. Um, I unfortunately, through the pandemic, that here in the UK, we're still feeling quite hard at the moment. But at the beginning of the year, I definitely had more time because
Hmm.
I was working as much and I wasn't able to engage and go and see friends and holidays, etc. So there was a natural opening in my time to be able to do this. But it also, that natural opening of time, allowed me to investigate more about my own mental health journey. So it was partly that I wanted to write this book for, to help other people and all of those philanthropic reasons that I should say. But
Hmm.
it was also very cathartic for me to kind of analyze my own journey and how far I've come.
Hmm.
And I don't think we as people celebrate the milestones that we achieve through life enough. And so through this book, it was also a great opportunity for me to kind of acknowledge that and the work that I've done on myself to get to this point.
Yeah, no, that's I mean, that is an important point because we often get caught up in achievements, and it's always one thing after the other, and we don't necessarily take that time to celebrate our successes because that does help as well, from a neurological perspective. And speaking of which, because you did mention CBT, neuroscience, do you have a background in any of those fields? What I'm trying to also maybe for the listeners is, if like this is stuff that we have access to now and we can learn so much, but is this something you have a background in?
So I have a background in terms of academia studying, but I don't have a practice background. So I've never practiced in
Hmm.
counselling or therapy, or any kind of um, one-on-one practice with people. That's not something I've ever wanted to do. I think
Hmm.
people who do that, therapists and counselors, are fantastic, unique people that bring so much to the healing of people with anxiety. It's a very specific skill set that I recognize I don't have.
Hmm.
Um, so my background is much more psychology from a academia point of view, and CBT, training in CBT, but then I haven't practiced
Hmm.
CBT, and anxiety from a neuroscience perspective, again through academic learning, and not through practicing. I've never worked in a
Yeah.
neuroscience lab.
Okay, fair. Yeah, and I think what I wanted to highlight there is, myself included, there's a lot of great information out there that you can use and that helps you understand kind of the neuroscience behind your, in terms of your brain and the neural pathways that you can form through habits. And I'm a total nerd when it comes to that stuff. So perhaps if we were to break it down, like when we talk about anxiety specifically, and in terms of our brain, like naturally we have these pathways that we're used to from childhood, um, and it's almost like training your brain in order to form habits and how you respond. Is there anything specific you can talk to in terms of when it comes to anxiety and some of the thoughts we get?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, actually, about the pathways that we build from childhood. But I think it's really interesting to go even further back,
Hmm.
as part of our evolution and how we're made up, and the point of the brain being there. I think it's really important to remember that your brain is there to keep you alive.
Hmm.
It has no moral obligation to make you happy. It is just there to predict the future to keep you safe, and
Hmm.
and that has always been, obviously it's worked well because we've evolved to continue on that path. The problem comes because when you look at the amount of change in societal change that we have, it has increased dramatically compared to the physiological changes that we've had. And so our brain is now bombarded with so many different stimuli that it has to make predictions about. Um, but it has nothing to work with to make those predictions based upon.
Hmm.
So looking for dangers in places that no longer exist. And so identifying things that are not predictable and
Hmm.
so therefore dangerous. And triggering the same mechanisms as it has done for thousands of years to make us behave in a way
Hmm.
that keeps us alive but not happy.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's recognizing that this bombardment that we're giving our brain, and recognizing that the more information we are piling into our brain to predict our future, the harder it is for our brain to slow down and make calculated decisions based on risk.
Hmm.
So a lot of the thoughts in the book, and the techniques in the book, is being able to work with your brain to slow that risk analysis down.
Hmm.
Um, and so it can say, actually, the notification from my phone, from my boss, um, that is going to spike adrenaline in me, and I am going to feel agitated.
Hmm.
Um, but let's just assess the risk of that. What's the real risk to me
Hmm.
in that, and what would be an appropriate response? And that sounds so simple and straightforward when I say it like that, but when you suffer from anxiety, um, and an anxious episode particularly, it's very hard to rationalize because it happens in a thousandth of a second that
Hmm.
all of those thought processes go through your head. And so it has to be almost a dogma that you instill in your life to constantly be challenging this spike of anxiety, this spike of adrenaline, and risk assess yourself and your thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the two key points I know from an evolutionary point you mentioned, because naturally we've evolved to respond in almost a fight or flight mechanism. I mean, you can throw freeze in there, but typically it's fight or flight, and that's how our brains are wired. And like you said, it's being able to basically program your brain to recognize that, okay, this situation is not a risk. Let's spend that extra 30 seconds to evaluate it. So that is definitely an important point. And I think the other point potentially is also understanding the difference between our emotions and feelings, right? So as you mentioned in your example, you may get a text from your boss. The emotion you may feel is fear or agitation, but how you feel about it is something you can determine. And I think through working through that, I know it's easier said than done. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of reminders. I personally struggle with it almost on a daily basis, but it's, I think that for people listening, the biggest stepping stone is first bringing awareness to it. And I think if you've at least brought awareness to it, you've done a majority of the work. And then it's taking the next steps of changing those habits. I guess from your own personal experience, you mentioned a lot of the inspiration behind the work you've done was kind of from your own personal experience. Do you mind touching on that a little bit? What really pushed you to be like, okay, well, this is a serious issue. I want to be able to have a book where I can help others.
Yeah, absolutely. I know in a couple of your podcasts you have mentioned, one of the key things you want to bring about is people to be more open about the way that they feel about their mental health.
Mhm,
That really resonated with me. I was kind of fortunate in an unfortunate way in that my anxiety was so apparent. There was no way I couldn't talk about it. It was
mhm,
visible to everybody around me, both at work, at home. It wasn't something I could hide. And at the time, that was awful, but actually, I'm quite grateful that it happened in such a spectacular firework way, because it meant I had to face it head on,
yeah.
hiding from that. So for me, it started my relationship with anxiety. It started probably in my teens, but it was not something I was aware of. That was something that I needed to address. It's only now looking back I recognize that. Um, but that's my first anxious episode, and maybe some of your listeners, this will resonate as well, as I'm not anxious all the time.
Hmm.
I have huge parts of my life where anxiety is not apparent, but then I have episodes where anxiety is all consuming. And so it's those episodes that kind of dominate the story of your life, I suppose. And so the first episode was in my early 20s, before children.
Hmm.
Um, I was not in any way stressed as I thought at the time.
Hmm.
There was nothing going on in my life that meant I was under undue pressure. And it really did feel like it had come from nowhere. And that was the most terrifying thing of it all, is having something happen to me that felt out of my control, that I hadn't seen coming, that wasn't something that um, somebody could say, oh, you did A and B, and so C has happened.
Hmm.
I like that. I'm very much a data driven person. And so I didn't like the randomness it felt to be
Yeah.
thrown into this.
Yeah.
But looking back, there was lots of signs and signals that had I been surrounded by people that were talking openly about those kind of emotions, I probably would have recognized earlier. So it was a shame that it was so spectacular, and probably within a month my whole life fell apart. I lived in London at the time, and I couldn't get on a tube to get to work. I couldn't be in my own flat. Just being at home didn't feel like a sanctuary, didn't feel safe, even though
Hmm.
I had no idea what I felt unsafe about. Um, but it took a good 3 or 4 months for me to drag myself to go and see a doctor. And that's one of the really really big points I want to labour about, actually, is please, if you feel in any way that anxiety is disrupting your natural, normal way of living your everyday life, it doesn't have to be that you're crippled in bed, but if anxiety is making your life no longer tolerable to you, you need to go and see somebody who sees this all the time. You need to see a doctor or a therapist or somebody who has some real understanding and insight into how to help you. And that doesn't mean so that they can give you drugs. I don't
Hmm.
mean that then you can be medicated, but you absolutely need to be open to recording how you are feeling and how you're progressing or not progressing. Is this something that is getting better or worse? Is
Hmm.
this um, doctors and therapists will have access to support groups that you won't be aware of. They'll
Mm-hmm.
have access to material that you will find very hard to find on your own. Being open to asking for help, um, not necessarily pharmacological help, but being open to that help can be transformative in those early stages. It can really stem the tide of anxiety for the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um,
no, I thank you for sharing that experience, and being vulnerable. So I guess when you did start recognizing from a medical standpoint that, you were struggling with anxiety, what did you do next? And yeah.
I did go and see the doctor much later than I ideally would have, and the doctor was fantastic, was very understanding. At that time, I didn't want to take medication. I was anxious about anxiety medication. So
Mm-hmm.
it was a no-win situation for me. But the doctor was great in helping me connect to support groups, websites, other areas that I could explore where the anxiety might be coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And just having something at that time, having something that I could control and own, my own learning was something I could control, and that felt reassuring.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it definitely was I'd hit the bottom, and that was a slow um, crawl back up to the top once I'd been to see a doctor. Very fortunate that here in the UK, that's free, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to pay for that service. So I do understand that it's not always as accessible as I make it sound if you're outside of the UK. But the doctor was very helpful in putting me in touch with the right people. I then tried CBT, um, which for me personally didn't work particularly well. I know it works for millions of people, and
Mm-hmm.
they have nothing but good things to say about it. But for me personally, it didn't. I would think I was too far down the Alice's rabbit hole
Mm-hmm.
to implement the techniques of CBT at that point. So it was a really slow recovery, leaning on a lot of people. I accessing people like Mind, the charity support group, um, and but it was probably a year of my life that I would say I lost.
Mm-hmm.
Anxiety, that I battled and fought and kicked against and railed against these feelings for a year before I kind of accepted the reality of what was happening and kind of leaned into those feelings and challenged my brain to see things through a different lens.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really where I started to recover.
Mm-hmm. And when you say seeing things differently, and so as you started to recover, what were some of the tools you were using? And again, just being mindful that some of these things are, for everyone it's a different approach. But what was kind of the approach you took, obviously recognizing that CBT wasn't working, or it was just at a point where it may not have worked? But what are some of the things you did? And I know you had mentioned also mindfulness. So yeah, was there an aspect of mindfulness that helped as well in your recovery?
Yeah, so in that first episode, I mean, I'm 46 now, so it was many years ago. Mindfulness wasn't really a word that was used. It was, was all about kind of CBT, and which
Mm-hmm.
is a lot of mindfulness, is in the practice of CBT. But for me, it was much more basic techniques that really lifted me in those early months. Um, one of which was I had stopped eating really.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Anxiety made me incredibly nauseous. And so I stopped eating, well, um, which I now know has a huge impact on your brain and your brain function. And if you don't eat, that can just in itself spiral anxiety. Your body will go into fight or flight of starvation.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the early things I did was I had a eating diary for the day,
Mm-hmm.
and it was things that I absolutely had to have eaten by the end of the day. And it was small things like, maybe an apple and some cheese, or a digestive biscuit, or some breadsticks, or something that I was regularly putting things into my body that reassured my body that we weren't in a starvation mode, that
Mm-hmm.
physically there was a abundance of food available if I could just eat it.
Mm-hmm.
And by eating regularly, the anxiety nausea does reduce. So that then kind of feeds the positivity to think, I want to eat a little bit more and a little bit more. And so that had a huge impact, because then the more I ate, the more energy I had, not to do huge things, but to want to be outside, to want to go for a walk,
Mm-hmm.
which then led into being able to sleep, which for my personal experience, the insomnia of anxiety was the most crippling.
Mm-hmm.
And so getting into a state where my body could rest and sleep really helped to recover. That was a key turning point for me, being able to go to bed and sleep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And we often forget the importance of sleep, and getting the proper, whether it's 8 hours of sleep. It is important because your body needs that time to recover. And that's when, you know, even your brain is probably functioning the most. So,
Want to insert there that that was one episode of anxiety that I recovered from, but there subsequent to that, I had you know some major anxious episodes after
hmm
having my children. And I know you had somebody on your podcast talking about men who, after their other halves,
yes.
have had and suffer with anxiety as well. And that time period in people's lives when they have children, both men and women,
hmm
um, so um, all encompassing in terms of change in your life. I'm amazed more people don't kind of go down a path of anxious thought
hmm
processes after having children. It's an incredibly difficult time. And I think there's a lot of work here in the UK. I don't know about in Canada, but there's a lot of work here in the UK after people, men and women, have become parents, where they're looked at from a um, mental health perspective of how are they coping with anxiety. And um, I think that's really important for people
hmm
to acknowledge that it's so common, and on various degrees of severity, but it's really common after having children to feel overwhelmed, um, with feelings of fear and responsibility, and all of those kind of quite debilitating emotions.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was talking to, my partner about this too. And unfortunately, we don't have the resources, at least here in Canada. You're often, you go for the prenatal classes and they kind of tell you what to expect during labor and what are the things you need to do with the baby, but they don't really prep you for after the fact when you get
Yeah.
home, right? And when you're all alone and your baby's crying all night and you're trying everything and he or she won't go to sleep and you're just up and you don't know what to do, and they don't really talk about the mental health aspect of it, and being able to ask for support, or because sometimes parents are on their own, they
Yeah.
don't have family support, and they're just figuring it out. And you know uh, I could speak for myself. I definitely struggled. My son was crying every night for 3 hours for an entire week. And, the first night you're just trying to figure out what's going on. And after a while, you just give up. And the thoughts that go through your head, you're just like, you know, when you come out of it, you're like, okay, well, wow, that was hard. But we don't have that support, and I'm sure even for women, I've heard stories about, how they're just exhausted and just don't know what to do, and there's overwhelmed. In my case, I was only home for a week, and then after that, I went back to work. But so at least I was able to get away. But like women don't have that option at times. So definitely, the mental health is huge. And unfortunately, in Canada, I don't know if it's changed over the years, but at least when I was going through it, when my son was born, we didn't have that kind of support.
Mm. And it's traumatic. I mean, you mentioned your son's now 7,
Yeah.
and that's still a very fresh in your mind, obviously, remembering
Yes.
those nights and feeling helpless. And it's incredibly common. And I think people are under the impression that you have a baby and you look at this baby and you feel immense love, and it will come natural, and you will know how to feed it, how to change it, how
Hmm.
to love it, and it will just happen in an organic way. And that, for many people, is not the reality. And I had my daughter, who's now 14, and they handed this baby over to me, and I didn't feel love. I
Hmm.
didn't feel this bond. I didn't feel a connection. I didn't feel overwhelmed with the need to be with her.
Hmm.
I just felt terrified. I felt crushingly responsible for something that I was ill equipped to deal with. And I couldn't believe that people were actually letting me bring this baby home.
Yeah.
And that was the overwhelming feeling for a long time, for a fair few weeks. I didn't feel the rush of love that everyone had promised I
Yeah.
would feel. I obviously wanted to do my best and look after her and be around her, but the the fear of getting it wrong was huge.
Hmm.
It really took away what enjoyment I should have had in those early days with my daughter, that feeling of not getting it right.
Hmm.
So yeah, I just, it's important that people know that it's not always the case that you get blessed with a baby and then you feel that you know what to do, or you have a maternal or paternal instinct. It's very normal to be scared and
Hmm.
feel um, overwhelmed with what to do. And it would be great if people at their prenatal and antenatal meetings talked about that more.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And even just talking with and asking for help, um, because again, it's that whole aspect of shame. So if as a parent, you bring your child home and you're struggling, and if you ask for help, there's this perception that you may feel you think that people may judge you for being ill-equipped or not being a good parent. And there's no again there's no book on how to deal with it, and everyone's experience is different. And if you feel overwhelmed, just speak up and ask for help. And I know, again, it's easier said than done, but you're doing yourself a service as well as your child if you are asking for support and help. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And you did mention that, after the birth of your daughter, or just going into that transition of being a mother, you had more episodes with anxiety. And how were you able to deal with them, that aspect of your life at that time?
Um, so the from the first episode of anxiety in my 20s, I had learnt what it was that was happening, at least. So
Hmm.
after the birth of my daughter, and I was feeling these feelings that were very familiar. unwanted but familiar, uh, I recognized that this was anxiety. This was anxiety that was going off the scale again. And that's that is scary as well, when you suddenly acknowledge, I'm going down a path that I've been before and I don't like where this path takes me.
Mm-hmm.
I can't find a route off this path. Um, so to have that with a newborn baby as well was particularly challenging. But having said that, I was, because of the way that I was at that point, I was very open about it as well, and I was talking to anybody I could about the way that I felt, and that definitely helped. I felt that people were very open to listening to me,
Mm-hmm.
and really hearing what I was saying, and in a non-judgmental way. So I know that I'm lucky that I had that support around me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, it came back to the simple things, and I talk about this in the book as well. You know, really taking it back to basics and saying, okay, I need to do the basics for me to be the best, healthiest version of me I can be.
Mm-hmm.
And that means I need to eat regularly, eat properly, I need to sleep, I need to rest, and I need to take exercise. And everything else I do over and above that will be a bonus. But
Mm-hmm.
those are the key things that I owe to my daughter, to do for myself. Without those cornerstones, the rest will fall apart. And so in the book, I labour on this point quite a bit, and but because for me it's so powerful, just doing those basic things for yourself um, makes a huge difference. And I don't think you can underestimate the benefits of a good night's sleep after having exercised and being good to your body and what you've put in.
Mm-hmm.
The benefits are immense the other side.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess, the thing I wanted to also highlight is it's okay to have feelings of anxiety, right? And everyone's experience is different. In my case, I feel a lot of it came from childhood. So, a lot of the work I've done is being able to identify my own attachment style. And my attachment style is one of an anxious person. So, naturally, I do get anxious when things don't go my way or certain things happen. But like you said, it's being aware of it and sticking to the basics. And I love how you broke it down. It's very simple stuff. And I find when I get stuck in my head, if I start uh, letting go of the things that I normally do, whether it's eating properly, just exercising, or even getting out, getting some fresh air. If I let go of those things and I sit in it and ruminate, it just snowballs from there. And it's being able to, again, using kind of the art of neuroscience, being able to identify when you're getting into that thought pattern and challenging yourself, as you've said. And I do want to highlight that for people as well, that there's nothing wrong with getting those thoughts. I think being able to recognize them and do something about it is the key.
Absolutely, absolutely. The sooner we can normalize feelings of anxiety, the better. I think we expect, our expectations of ourselves are so high now to constantly be either happy or contented or blissful or in love, or all of these positive emotions and feelings. So when feelings like anxiety or anger or agitation or anything that's remotely negative, the first response is, why me? Why is this
Hmm.
happening? This always happens to me. I always feel like this. I'm never going to be better. um, I just want it to stop, and I want to go back to being me, being normal. It's this resistance to accepting that being anxious is also part of you, in the same way as being in love is part of you and being happy is part of you. It all makes a rounded experience of a life. Um, it's the tipping point is when the anxiety detracts you from living a normal life, your normal life, what's normal for you. And
Hmm.
when it tips over to that point, I think that's when you need to ask for help, and
Yes.
take it as a trigger that your body's giving you, to pay attention.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that's that's right on because I mean, even for myself, when I was going through my own kind of an- anxious thoughts and point in my life when I was struggling with anxiety, especially going through separation and not being able to see my son, I needed to pull myself out of it, but I also went and sought help through therapy and just having someone to talk to who's able to give me different uh, exercises and activities to kind of focus on made a
Yeah,
huge difference. And again, I think the underlying point here is there's nothing wrong with asking for help. There's no shame in it. We just need to be able to open ourselves up to it rather than just struggle in silence.
absolutely,
So,
absolutely.
so the book just came out, and you've said it's been well received. So what are your plans for the future? And what are some things people can continue to do to deal with anxiety from your perspective?
So I think what I'd really want people to take away from this podcast, if they've listened this far to my waffling, is firstly, as I said, seek help. Is go
Hmm.
in and speak to people. Um, but the second thing is find what I call in the book, behavior spotters. And so these are people in your life that know you, well enough to notice when you're behaving or responding to situations differently, and that you have a good enough relationship that they can, challenge you on that and say, you seem to be more agitated about the fact that the tube is late than you
Hmm.
should be, or you seem to be more irritable around, things that aren't going well at work. And I find, and the people that I talk to that have these behavior spotters find, is when somebody else brings that up to you, it suddenly becomes much clearer. The clarity that you have when somebody else identifies the changes that you're, um, demonstrating, it's like an aha moment.
Hmm.
Anxiety building up in me. I don't need to wait until the critical point of anxiety where it's all consuming, and, um, you've got to, struggling to function. If you can have these behavior spotters in your life that can kind of identify when your behavior is changing, really helps to find the root of those triggers early on. So for me, I know that if my sister, will say you're much more irritable about things, I know for me that irritation is actually anxiety.
Hmm.
And I may not be able to identify what I'm anxious about, but I definitely need to do some more exercise, get some more rest, be a bit kinder to myself,
Hmm.
um, be outside. And by somebody else identifying it early, it means it hasn't got to a critical point where I have to intervene in such a dramatic way.
Yeah, and I think this concept of behavior spotters is amazing because I don't think we necessarily a either think about that or b have these people in our lives. So I think for listeners, I think part of it is also that you, if someone is coming to you and being kind enough and courageous enough to identify the behaviors you may be exhibiting, don't be defensive, and acknowledge that they're doing it out of kindness because they care for you. Um, so yeah, those are the things I would highlight because often our like for me personally, I would struggle with hearing that feedback. I would be like, well, what are you talking about? And my natural tendency would be to get defensive.
Yeah.
But but rather than acknowledge that, hey, maybe this person is seeing something in me that I'm not aware of, and what can I do with this information? um,
Absolutely. Oh, for sure. I mean, it's never easy hearing people, even your sister, say you're irritable. But
yeah.
these these behaviors that you are demonstrating to the people around you, they know you well enough to know that that isn't your modus operandi. And so the fact that they are bringing it up, um, it's really important that you
Hmm.
acknowledge that that's not something they normally see in me. So something is going on, and what you choose to do with that is with you. But I think in everyday life, if we were just a bit more open to people giving us feedback about, our responses, we might take these things a little more at face value. I think
Hmm.
we do overanalyze. Everybody wants to be perfect all the
Hmm.
time. Um, and
Hmm.
it's important to acknowledge that some days you're not, some days you are just irritable for no reason.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there needs to be a level of trust as well in those relationships where you can trust the other person, um, for sure.
Mm,
Um, so I guess, I mean, the last question I would have for you is like, so you've come a long way from your initial episode of anxiety and to this point. Is this something you still struggle with, or obviously you're saying you have people in your life that identify certain behaviors, but is this something you still struggle with? And if you do, what are the things you have for yourself in place that allow you to not let it escalate too far?
mm. So I think I'm confident in saying I don't see my anxiety as something I struggle with anymore. It is part of me, and
Mm-hmm.
part of my natural disposition is that I am anxious, and that is part of who I am. And so I don't think I can say anxiety is something I want to cure, for example. It is something that also brings out really positive parts of my personality. My anxiety makes me very empathetic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my anxiety makes me very, um, self, discovering. So there are some really good things that come about by acknowledging that my brain is more anxious than, it needs to be. Um, but I don't have panic attacks. I haven't had a
Mm-hmm.
panic attack, for maybe 10, 15 years, a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so now I'm in a situation where I acknowledge that anxiety is part of my natural defense mechanism in life. And so I have to find ways to challenge those thoughts that I have. And it's part of my, understanding of myself for the future as well. So the key things that I do, and I would encourage people, to do, is I write things down all the
Mm-hmm.
time. And it doesn't need to be important things, but just everything needs to be written down. Anxiety has a brilliant way of making you forget.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it makes you forget when things have been good. It makes you forget when things are positive. It makes you forget when you've slept really well. Um, it's really good at helping you just remember the awful bits.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I write things down all the time. Um, and some people call those gratitude journals, and they can, you can buy specific journals that prompt you to do that. And I think people get a lot of value from those. Um, but it doesn't have to be so formal, just
Mm-hmm.
writing things down, anywhere, even if you lose that piece of paper, just the act of writing it down, helps to commit it to memory. So I do that a lot. um, I exercise, which I know, I can hear everybody listening to this podcast kind of exhaling in disgust of, oh, here we go again, exercise, exercise. Um, but I don't mean exercise training. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
exercise as in I get out every day and I
Mm-hmm.
go for a walk. Sometimes I might move into a jog, um, but I move my body, and
Mm-hmm.
I be outside in the fresh air. And there's something, um, going off on a tangent here, sorry. But there's a neuroscientist called Dr. Huberman, who you can find on YouTube and
Hmm.
Instagram, actually, who is fantastic at really distilling down some very complicated principles of neuroscience into very easy to implement things. And one of the things that he talks about is the impact on your brain of just walking forward when you're anxious. So your brain automatically soothes itself when you're moving forward. When your eyes recognize the world going past you and you moving forward, it reassures itself that you are moving away from danger,
Hmm.
um, coming back to the fight or flight
Hmm.
response. And so by going for a walk, apart from all the respiratory benefits, it's also soothing your mind, that by you're moving forward, you're moving away from whatever is holding you back, whatever anxious thoughts were there. Um, so moving your body outside is really important. Um, and it's those two things I would
Hmm.
say to focus on.
Absolutely. And I think you've touched on many important things. I guess the biggest thing that I really appreciate that you mentioned is looking at the anxiety in a positive light. And, we often get stuck and we think it's such a bad thing. It's so negative. But the fact that you are able to look at it positively in terms of how it's made you more empathetic, um, and how it's made you more aware. I think that's important things, and I think those things are there for a reason if we can tap into the positivity. So I do appreciate you mentioning that. And then the other thing you did touch on was writing those positive things in our life down. Because yeah, when we're stuck in that, when we're ruminating and we're stuck in that thought pattern, the only things we actually focus on is the negativity, and that just brings us down further. So that's a really good point. And the last piece, I think, the exercise, you're right, it when we talk about exercise, we don't mean going to the gym or going for a run. Exercise means any form of movement. And when we're stuck, or we're lying in bed, or we're just sitting in a chair, just stuck in negative thoughts, we're not moving our body. And by moving our body, whether it's a walk, or bike ride, or anything, you're actually, yeah, you're getting that positivity again in, um, and changing those negative thought patterns. So thank you for highlighting all that. I again, I'm super grateful for you to come here, share your story, talk about the book. I hope people can get a hold of the book, or just even listen to the podcast and learn so much. I've taken a lot out of this conversation for me as well. Just, I've also experienced anxiety, but being able to kind of talk through some of the simple things we can do has definitely benefited me and given me a different mindset towards it. I guess for people that want to get a hold of you, what's the best way, through social media, or yeah?
Yeah, so the best way to get a hold of me is on Instagram, as the same way we connected,
Yes.
uh, through either Tori Warner or Challenging the Anxious Brain. And I love talking to people on Instagram. I'm always really grateful at how open people are on Instagram, and open to discussing their feelings. And I'm always amazed at how what a lovely community it is on Instagram. So that's definitely a good way, not just to reach out to me, but if you are having some questions or thoughts around what could help, that's also a great forum
Hmm.
in there that people kind of share ideas on what's working for them. So I definitely recommend getting in touch that way. And I've loved being talking to you. This has been really exciting. It's if only things like this had been available, when I was younger and first experiencing anxiety, things would have been very different. And so it's great that podcasts like this exist, and
Hmm.
people can listen to other people's real stories and take what works for them, and see if they can get benefit from it too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's kind of the point of the podcast, is to normalize these conversations and recognize that, we're all just regular people in this world figuring things out, and that's where others that are struggling, they can take the same approach. It's not like we're experts in the field, or we
No,
have an abundant amount of resources. We're all figuring it out as we go. So, um,
definitely.
yeah. Yeah. So, Tori, thanks again for joining. I truly appreciate you taking the time and being vulnerable. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too, and I've loved it, and I'll definitely keep listening. And I really hope we'll speak again in the future. It's been great.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's the end of the podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And again, please leave a review at the end of the episode. I would truly appreciate it. Until next week.